Okay, this is going to be example 1 for chapter 6, section 1. So these are our inverse trig functions. So we're starting with inverse sine, which is a good place to start since we started learning trig functions with sine. So you can see right here all the information you need to know about inverse sine. It can be written two ways. It can be written as y equals sine to the -1 of x, or y equals arc sine x. And it's said either way, inverse sine or arc sine. I like to say arc sine because if I remember when you're using arc sine, because it starts with an A, you're finding an angle. So I like to use arc sine, but you can say it either way, and either one can be used, and both will be used interchangeably throughout MyLabs Plus. So just be prepared to see either one. They mean the exact same thing. The other thing that you need to remember about arc sine, I hope you watched the short video on the inverses and what they look like, because there are domain restrictions in order to make them functions. So arc sine only exists from -pi/2 to pi/2. So that needs to be kept in mind when you're doing each one of these functions. Okay, so in example 1, we're looking for y equals arc sine of a half. Now, there are two ways that you can do this. You can do this, obviously you can do it with your calculator, but you can also, if you had the graph, you could look at the graph of arc sine and you could say where x is a half, what is y. But the other thing that you can always do is ask yourself, where is sine a half? So I can think of the places where sine is a half. And if you use the left-hand trick, I remember sine is my x value. Sine is my y value. And so I would need one finger on bottom. So if you're doing that, you'd fold in this one, which is your pi/6 value, or 30. So the answer is pi/6. I will show you in just a second the calculator way to do it also. Same thing here. I ask myself, where is sine -1? So I have to think about where sine is -1. Well, sine is the y value. At pi/2, sine is 1. At -pi/2, and it does say equal to, so I can say it's -pi/2. You can't use 3/2 pi because it doesn't go to 3/2 pi. It only goes between pi/2 and -pi/2. And then the last one, y equals sine, arc sine of -2, or the inverse sine of -2. Well, in this case, it doesn't exist. So, and the way that you know that is because, remember, we have switched x and y of when we did the inverse, and sine's y values go from -1 to 1, -1 to 1, -1 to 1, which means that the x values of arc sine can only go -1 to 1, which means -2 does not exist. So, all right, so now let's real quick look at these with the calculator and what would happen if you put them in the calculator. So here's my calculator. You can see your arc functions, inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent are all written above sine, cosine, and tangent, which means you're going to have to hit the blue button. So I would just hit second, and it'll put up inverse sine, and I can put in the fraction bar if you want to put in the fraction bar, or you could just use division if you. Either way, I have no idea what mode my calculator's in. Aha, my calculator is in degrees, because pi/6 is 30. But if it were not, let's go back and switch it to radians. They did not specify how they wanted the answers on this. So, so 30 degrees would be fine. But let's look at what it would look like as radians. It's going to be a decimal. There you go. So that would be, that's the same thing as pi/6. On MyLabs Plus, it'll specify degrees or radians, and it'll also specify exact answers, or it'll tell you how many decimals to round to. Same thing. I'm actually just going to go up here and grab this since these are all sine. And I'm going to go in here and delete these things and put in -1. And I get -pi/2. Or if I was going to go back and we'll put it, since it didn't specify whether we were doing radians or degrees, I could do the same thing. And it gives me -90, which is the same thing as -pi/2. And then the last one, I'll show you what it's going to say if you put in something that won't work. Domain. It's a domain error because this value doesn't exist in the domain of this particular function. So that's it for how arcsine or inverse sine is going to work.